The hive mind did not scream when the first shadow, tendril of the warp, bifurcated a titan on the crust of Ghostful. It simply adjusted its caloric intake calculations. For 12 millennia, we believed the Great Devourer and the Ruinous Powers were incompatible predators, two apex nightmares destined to grind one another into cosmic dust while the Imperium breathed in the pauses. That comforting delusion died the moment the Splinter Fleet Ouroboros began displaying ossified plating etched with shifting, non-Euclidean geometries that repelled bolter fire and sorcery with equal indifference. I sat in the strategium of the Iron Penance, watching the grainy picked feeds of Tyranid organisms not merely resisting the corruption of the Empyrean, but physically consuming the localized reality, warps generated by the Great Rift. The biological became the metaphysical. The predator has finally tasted the soul, and it found the flavor efficient. The transition did not occur with a thunderclap or a dramatic psychic schism, but rather with the rhythmic, wet thud of biological evolution meeting the impossible logic of the immaterium. I remember the taste of the air inside the primary observation blister of the Iron Penance. It was a stagnant cocktail of recycled oxygen, the copper tang of blood from a dozen hemorrhaging servitors, and the cloying, oily sweetness of sacred unguents applied to the cogitator banks. We were positioned in the high anchor of the Ghostful system, a region of space that had become a charnel house, where the word-bearer's legion had attempted to tear a permanent wound in the fabric of the galaxy. They had succeeded, but the victory they expected, a kingdom of screaming madness, was being systematically devoured by a force that possessed no soul to torture. I watched through the reinforced transparisteel as the first wave of mycetic spores descended through the atmospheric veil of Ghostful Prime. But these were not the dull, leathery pods of Hive Fleet Leviathan or Behemoth. These pods were translucent, pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly light that matched the frequency of the warp rift pulsing at the planet's pole. As the spores breached the upper thermosphere, the sky did not burn with the usual friction of entry. Instead, the reality, warping energies of the rift seemed to flow into the organisms, coating them in a shimmering, prismatic film that defied the laws of physics. Below them, on the surface of the hive world, the heretics were chanting. I could hear the echo of their blasphemy through the vox casters, a low, vibrating hum that made the marrow in my bones itch. They were welcoming the chaos, believing the shadow in the warp was merely a biological storm they could weather or command. They were catastrophically wrong. I saw the first contact between a swarm of hormagaunts and a localized manifestation of a bloodletter host. Typically, the Daemons of Khorne would find little sustenance in the cold, unfeeling minds of the Tyranids. But this time was different. The gaunts did not simply claw and bite, they absorbed. Their carapaces were no longer just organic chitin. They were becoming receptive to the warp energy, acting like biological lightning rods that grounded the Daemons into the physical plane, before tearing them into digestible fragments of psychic essence. I turned my gaze to the bioscanners, where the Magos biologists were screaming technical jargon into their data slates, their mechanical mechadendrites twitching in a frantic dance of recording and analysis. They pointed to the genetic readouts of the captured specimens from the initial landings. The genome of the Splinter Fleet Ouroboros was shifting at a rate that bypassed all known evolutionary constraints. It was as if the hive mind had finally cracked the code of the Empyrean, treating the warp not as a hostile environment, but as a new reservoir of nutrients. The drones were developing specialized organs, sensory pits that could track the flow of warp currents, and specialized glandular systems that secreted a substance capable of stabilizing the shifting geography of a chaos-tainted world. They were terraforming a nightmare into a larder. The iron taste in my mouth intensified as I realized the magnitude of the catastrophe. If the Tyranids could adapt to the warp, then the one true barrier protecting the galaxy, the inherent instability of chaos, was being nullified by the ultimate biological machine. The war on the ground was a descent into a new kind of hell. I watched a recording from a downed Valkyrie's picked recorder. It showed a cathedral plaza in Hive Tarsus, where the marble statues of saints had been twisted into weeping icons of obsidian by the word-bearers. A swarm of Tyranid gargoyles descended, their wings translucent and flickering like the wings of a moth in a flame. They did not attack the cultists first. They flew directly into the center of the warp, gate the heretics had opened. We expected them to be incinerated or possessed. Instead, they began to feed on the very energy of the portal. The gate began to shrink, its edges frayed and chewed away by the sheer presence of the swarm. The gargoyles' bodies swelled, their veins glowing with a terrifying, ethereal fire. When they finally turned their attention to the heretics, their spit was not acidic, it was a concentrated burst of warp, fire that unmade the cultists' souls before their bodies even hit the scorched earth. The vox chatter from our ground teams became a chorus of despair. Even the hardened soldiers of the Cadian 40th, who had seen every horror the galaxy had to offer, were breaking. They spoke of the shimmering, a term they gave to the new strain of Tyranid organisms that seemed to phase in and out of existence, mimicking the movement of Daemons but with the relentless, coordinated lethality of the Hive. My hands trembled as I adjusted the focus on the long-range scanners. On the horizon of the northern continent, a Hive tyrant was rising. It was a massive, towering monstrosity, its multiple limbs holding blades that hummed with a psychic resonance so loud it caused the ship's internal chronometers to start running backward. The creature wasn't just leading a swarm, it was acting as a focal point for the warp itself. Around it, the very air was turning into a thick, gelatinous ichor that the lesser organisms were drinking. They were literally consuming the atmosphere of a daemon world to fuel their expansion. I felt a pressure in my skull, a dull ache that signaled the Hive Mind's presence was no longer just a shadow, but a physical weight pressing against the ship's Geller field. The bridge of the iron pennants felt smaller, the walls closing in as the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and hunger. We were witnesses to the birth of a new predator, one that looked at the madness of the Eye of Terror and saw only a banquet. The Mechanicus adepts began to self-terminate, their logic circuits unable to reconcile the biological impossibility unfolding before them. They could not understand how a purely material organism could integrate the immaterial without collapsing into a pile of mutated flesh. But the Tyranid does not care for the laws of man or the logic of the machine. It only cares for the harvest. The planetary governor's palace was the last holdout. Through the thermal imaging, I saw the word-bearers launching a desperate counter-offensive, summoning greater Daemons to halt the tide. A great unclean one, a mountain of rotting flesh and disease, manifested in the palace gardens. Under normal circumstances, its mere presence would rot the very DNA of anything nearby. But as the Tyranids swarmed over it, they did not die of plague. They mutated in real time. Their shells thickened into pustulant, armored blisters that fed on the Daemon's toxins. They were using the Lord of Decay's own gifts to build a better armor. It was a cycle of consumption that turned the greatest weapons of the warp into mere building blocks for the Hive's next generation. The great unclean one's laughter turned into a gurgling shriek of genuine fear as it realized it was being eaten, not just physically, but its very essence was being drained into the bottomless gullet of the Hive Mind. The sky over Gorstfall turned a deep, bruised purple, the color of a fresh hematoma. The stars were being blotted out, not by clouds, but by the sheer density of the ships moving into low orbit. They were pulsing in unison, a heartbeat that echoed through the hull of our ship. I could feel the vibration in my teeth, a low, frequency hum that spoke of a hunger that would never be satisfied. We were no longer just observers, we were the next course. I ordered the iron pennants to retreat to the outer system, but the navigation systems were failing. The warp drive was screaming, sensing a presence in the Empyrean that shouldn't exist, a biological entity that was reaching into the warp to pull itself forward. The Tyranids were no longer just traveling through space. They were swimming through the tides of the warp, with the grace of sharks in a bloody sea. I looked at the final data, transmissions from the surface before the Vox array melted. The heretics were gone. The Daemons were gone. The only thing left on Ghostful was a carpet of pale, pulsating lichen that was rapidly dissolving the remains of the Hive cities. And in the center of it all, the Hive tyrant stood, its eyes glowing with a cold, blue light that held none of the mindless hunger we had seen before. There was a calculation there, a cold and terrible intelligence that had looked into the abyss and found it wanting. It had learned, it had adapted, and now it was looking up at the stars, toward the heart of the Imperium, with a new understanding of how to break the galaxy. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. It was the silence of a predator that has finished its meal and is already thinking about the next. The log entries of the Iron Penance will show that we fled. They will show that we abandoned a system to the great devourer. But they will not show the truth of what I saw in those final moments. The sight of a Tyranid warrior growing a third eye that wept black tears of warp matter. Or the way the ground itself seemed to scream as the bio-acids dissolved the very concept of reality. We are used to fighting monsters. We are used to fighting gods. But we are not prepared for a monster that can eat a god and grow stronger for it. The shadow in the warp is no longer a localized phenomenon. It is becoming a permanent eclipse. My hand shook as I signed the final clearance for the ship's log. I knew then that the war had changed. The rules of engagement, the holy scriptures of the Tactica, the very foundations of our faith, all of it was being rendered obsolete by a creature that viewed our souls as nothing more than a complex form of protein. I walked through the lower decks, past the rows of terrified crewmen huddling in the shadows of the bulkheads. The ship felt cold, despite the thrumming of the engines. The air was thin, the life support systems struggling to filter out a fine, grey dust that had begun to accumulate on every surface. It wasn't ash, it was spores. Even here, in the supposed safety of the void, the Hive Mind was reaching out. I touched a wall and felt a faint, organic pulse beneath the cold steel. The Iron Penance was being claimed. We were being integrated. I could hear a faint scratching behind the walls. The sound of thousands of tiny claws working their way through the wiring and the insulation. They weren't trying to destroy the ship. They were trying to understand it, to map its functions so they could replicate them in the next ship, in the meditation chamber. I found the ship's chaplain slumped against the altar. His crozius dropped on the floor. He wasn't dead, but his mind was gone. He kept muttering about the angel of the void, and how it had wings made of static and teeth made of stars. He had looked into the warp to seek guidance from the Emperor, and had found only the great devourer staring back. The horror was not just in the physical threat, but in the spiritual vacuum. The Tyranids were consuming the very possibility of hope. If they could adapt to the warp, then there was no sanctuary left, not in the physical realm, and certainly not in the one beyond. The light of the Astronomicon felt dim, a flickering candle in a hurricane of hungry darkness. As the Iron Penance finally broke warp orbit and limped toward the nearest fortress world, I sat in my quarters and watched the footage of Ghostful one last time. The planet was no longer a sphere of rock and iron. It was a living thing, a giant, pulsing egg of biological matter that was slowly unfolding. It was the ultimate expression of the Hive Mind's new mastery. It wasn't just taking resources, it was claiming the very space the planet occupied. I realized then that the Tyranids didn't want to conquer the galaxy. They wanted to replace it. Every star, every planet, every living soul was just a temporary state of matter that they were destined to reclaim and reforge into their own image. And with their new, found ability to harvest the warp, there was nothing to stop them from rewriting the laws of existence itself. The report I am writing will likely be buried by the Inquisition. They will call it the ramblings of a man broken by the sight of a Xenos invasion. They will say that the Tyranids cannot possibly master the warp, that the two forces are fundamentally opposed. But I know what I saw. I saw the future, and it was a chitinous claw reaching out of a rift in time to snuff out the sun. I saw the end of all things, and it didn't come with a roar of fire or a chorus of angels. It came with the sound of a billion mouths chewing in the dark. My eyes are tired, and the grey dust is getting thicker in the room. I can hear the scratching in the vents getting louder. I think I will stop writing now. There is no point in recording the end if there is no one left to read it. The hive mind is here, and it is very, very hungry. The void of the Ghostful system did not simply become empty after the Iron Penance fled. It became a digestive tract, a localized throat in the cosmos that was swallowing the very concept of linear time and Euclidean geometry. I sat in the darkness of my cabin, the only illumination provided by the dying amber glow of a single data slate, listening to the ship's hull groan under the pressure of a reality that no longer wanted to hold its shape. The reports coming in from the secondary Vox relays were not of ship movements or tactical retreats, but of biological anomalies that defied every tenet of the cult mechanicus. On the surface of the moon's orbiting Ghostful, the Tyranid spores had begun to weave massive, pulsating lattices of bone and nerve, fiber that reached upward, not to touch the sky, but to pierce the thin veil between the material and the Empyrean. They were building antennae for the soul. I watched a recovered feed from a servo skull that had survived the initial collapse of the word-bearer's fortress on the planet's surface. The heretics, those masters of the profane, were being hunted by things that shouldn't exist even in the fever dreams of a madman. I saw a squad of chaos terminators, their armor fused with the warp stuff of 10 millennia, being systematically disassembled by a new strain of lictor. This creature did not just use camouflage, it existed in a state of quantum superposition, its body flickering like a bad pict, feed as it stepped through the very warp rifts the heretics were trying to use as escape routes. The lictor would vanish from the physical plane and reappear inside the Terminator's tactical dreadnought armor, its claws already buried in their blackened hearts. It was a predator that had learned to walk the corridors of the mind, a ghost with teeth of diamond and a hunger that never abated. The most terrifying realization came when the Magos biologist, before he took his own life with a surgical laser, managed to sequence a fragment of the warp gourd, a massive, fleshy organ growing at the heart of the primary Tyranid nest. It wasn't just filtering warp energy, it was purifying it. The raw, chaotic essence of the immaterium, which usually results in mutation and madness, was being distilled into a stable, biological fuel. The hive mind had found a way to strip the chaos out of chaos. It was treating the gods of the warp as nothing more than a high-yield energy source, a volatile battery that it was learning to drain. I felt a coldness in my stomach that had nothing to do with the ship's failing life support. If the Tyranids could neutralize the corruption of the warp, then the Great Rift, the very thing that had torn our galaxy in half, was no longer a barrier, it was a highway. On the bridge, the atmosphere had turned into a thick, soup-like fog. The crew were moving with a strange, lethargic rhythm, their eyes vacant and milky. They weren't being possessed. That would have been a mercy, I understood. Instead, they were being synchronized. The shadow in the warp was no longer just a psychic static that drowned out the Astronomicon. It had become a directive. I saw a rating standing by the atmospheric scrubbers, slowly peeling the skin from his own arm with a rusted tool, not out of pain or madness, but with the methodical precision of a drone clearing a blockage. He was mirroring the movements of a ripper swarm miles below us on the planet's surface. The individuality of the human soul was being overwritten by the collective instinct of the hive, forced into a sympathetic resonance with the great devouring consciousness. I began to record the sounds of the ship, Not the engines, but the internal noises. There was a wet, rhythmic pulsing coming from the water reclamation pipes. When I unscrewed a maintenance hatch, I didn't find water. I found a thick, translucent jelly filled with millions of tiny, swimming cilia. The ship's lifeblood was being replaced. The Iron Penance was no longer an imperial vessel. It was becoming a gestating organism. I realized then that the Tyranids didn't need to board us with boarding pods or bio-acid. They just needed to be near us. Their very presence was an infectious blueprint that dictated to all matter, organic or inorganic, that it must become part of the swarm. The iron taste in my mouth had turned into the flavor of wet earth and rotting lilies. In the secondary strategium, the holographs were displaying the movement of the splinter fleet Ouroboros as it left the Ghostful system. It wasn't heading toward the next inhabited world. It was heading directly into the heart of a nearby warp storm, a region of space so volatile that even the most daring navigator would avoid it at all costs. But the bio-ships didn't hesitate. They adjusted their fleshy fins and dived into the screaming vortex of the Empyrean like whales returning to the deep ocean. Through the long-range sensors, I saw the storm actually calm as they entered it. The swirling colors of the warp were being sucked into the bio-ships, leaving behind a wake of dead, gray space. They were drinking the storm dry. This was the ultimate adaptation. For millions of years, the Tyranids had consumed the biomass of the galaxy. Now, they were beginning to consume its metaphysical foundation. Every prayer whispered to the Emperor, every scream dedicated to the dark gods. Every emotion that fed the warp was now being intercepted and digested by the Hive Mind. They were starving the gods. I thought of the Golden Throne, of the Emperor's light struggling to pierce the encroaching gloom, and I realized that the light wasn't being blocked. It was being eaten. The Astronomicon was a dinner bell. I encountered a survivor from the lower decks, a terrified midshipman who had hidden in a lead-lined locker. He told me that the shadows in the cargo hold had started to grow teeth. He described how the crates of rations had turned into mounds of pulsing flesh, and how the servitors had begun to graft themselves together into a singular, many-limbed mass that sang in a voice like grinding metal. He wept as he spoke, but his tears were the same iridescent echo I had seen on the planet's surface. I had to execute him. I used my service pistol, the sound of the shot echoing hollowly in the damp, crowded corridor. When I looked at the floor, the blood didn't pool. It started to crawl toward the nearest vent. Even the dead were trying to rejoin the collective. The pressure in my skull became a rhythmic thumping, a countdown. I walked past the chapel, where the stained glass had been replaced by a thin, leathery membrane that vibrated with every beat of the ship's dying heart. Inside, the incense was replaced by the smell of a slaughterhouse in midsummer. I saw the images of the saints melting, their features smoothing over until they resembled the blank, faceless masks of the Tyranid warriors. The Hive Mind was not just consuming our bodies, it was erasing our culture, our history, our very identity, and replacing it with the singular, horrific purpose of the feed. As I reached the primary data vault, I saw that the cogitator cores were covered in a fine, crystalline moss that glowed with a pale blue light. The machine spirits were screaming. Their binary chants turned into a discordant shriek of agony as the moss bypassed their logic gates and began to feast on the data stored within. The Tyranids were learning our codes, our ciphers, the locations of our hidden fortresses, and our most secret weapon silos. They weren't just eating our food, they were eating our secrets. I tried to initiate the vault's self-destruct sequence, but the keys had been fused shut by a fast-growing resin. I stood there, surrounded by the ruins of human ingenuity, and I felt a strange sense of clarity. We had always viewed the Tyranids as a biological plague, a mindless swarm that could be outthought or outmaneuvered. But this new evolution, this warp-attuned hive mind, was something else entirely. It was a cosmic correction. It was the universe deciding that the chaos of life and the madness of the soul were inefficiencies that needed to be purged. We were the noise, and the hive mind was the silence. I looked out of a small porthole at the trailing edge of the ship. In the distance, I could see the silhouette of a hive ship. It was beautiful in a way that made me want to gouge my eyes out. Its translucent skin revealed a complex network of glowing veins, and its long, flowing tentacles seemed to be stroking the fabric of space itself. It looked like a god from a pre-imperial myth, a celestial dragon come to reclaim the stars. And then I saw it a smaller craft, an imperial shuttle, being pulled into one of the hive ship's many maws. It didn't explode. It was just absorbed, like a drop of ink in a bucket of water. The ship's internal vox crackled to life, but there were no words. Just the sound of breathing, not human breathing, but a deep, resonant inhalation that sounded like a forest moving in the wind. It was coming from every speaker on every deck. The hive mind was no longer just outside, it was breathing through the ship's lungs. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, and when I looked down, I saw a small, thorn-like protrusion pushing out through my uniform. It was growing from my own ribs. I am not being eaten. I am being rewritten. I have one last clip of ammunition in my pistol. I am writing these words on the back of a tactical map, hoping that somehow, against all probability, this record survives the digestion of the iron penance. If you are reading this, know that the war is already over. We are not fighting for survival anymore. We are just the last few cells of a dying organism that doesn't realize it has already been replaced. The shadow in the warp has found a way to become the warp itself, and the galaxy is nothing more than a feast that has finally been served. The light in the vault is fading now. The blue moss is covering the last of the glowing screens. The scratching behind the walls has stopped, replaced by a wet, sucking sound. I can hear the heartbeat of the hive ship outside, and it is the same as my own. We are one. We are the swarm, and we are so very, very hungry. I will not give them the satisfaction of my mind. I will not let them have my memories. I will. The transition from being a vessel of the Emperor's will to a hollowed out husk of biological engineering occurred in the silent intervals between my own heartbeats. I found myself standing in the primary navigation spire of the iron penance, but the metal floor was no longer cold. It had developed a soft, yielding texture, like the inner lining of a stomach. The deck plating was being replaced by a keratinous substance that pulsed with a dull, rhythmic light. Every breath I took felt heavier, as if the oxygen was being replaced by a slurry of microscopic spores, designed to rewrite my lungs from the inside out. I looked at my hands and saw the veins had turned a dark, bruised violet, tracing patterns that didn't follow the human circulatory system. They were mapping the stars, or perhaps they were mapping the hive mind's hunger across the localized sector. I could feel the ship's cogitators dying, not because of power failure, but because they were being digested. The silicon chips were being broken down into their base elements to feed the growth of a giant, organic brain cluster that was currently expanding through the floorboards of the bridge. The tactical displays, which once showed the proud red icons of Imperial battlegroups, were now flickering with a bioluminescent slime that projected images of the galaxy as a network of interconnected feeding tubes. Gorstful was gone, not just conquered, but physically unmade. The planet had been cracked open by the sheer growth of the biomass. Its iron core harvested to provide the structural skeleton for a new class of hive ship. A vessel that did not merely travel through the warp, but seemed to be composed of it. I watched the holographic remnants of a battle at the edge of the system where a word-bearer's fleet had attempted to flee. Their ships, encrusted with the skulls of 1,000 sacrifices and protected by the most potent sorcery, were not engaged in a conventional void war. They were being hunted by shadow swarms, clouds of nano-scale organisms that ignored shields and armor, flowing through the hull plating like smoke through a sieve. These organisms didn't kill the heretics. They unmade their connection to the warp. I saw a repulsive, class Grand Cruiser simply dissolve into a cloud of grey ash as the Tyranid spores consumed the psychic energy, holding the ship's chaotic mutations together. The Hive Mind had reached a level of sophistication that rendered our most advanced doctrines of sinology useless. We had always assumed the Tyranid was a biological machine of consumption, but on Ghostful, it became something closer to a metaphysical architect. I moved toward the central command throne, my boots sticking to the floor with a wet, sucking sound. The officer who had been sitting there was still present, but he had been grafted into the chair. His spine had elongated, merging with the ship's wiring, and his eyes had been replaced by crystalline sensory pits that were staring into the Empyrean. He wasn't screaming. He was whispering in a language of clicks and high-frequency screeches, his mind acting as a relay for the swarm's tactical maneuvers. I realized then that the Hive Mind wasn't just using us as food, it was using our nervous systems as a cheap, pre-built infrastructure to expand its own consciousness. We were the sub-processors for an alien god. As I stood there, a sudden tremor shook the ship, but it wasn't the impact of a weapon. It was a birth. From the central elevator shaft, a massive, dripping form began to haul itself onto the bridge. It was a neuroterrant, but its form was distorted by the energy it had siphoned from the Ghostful rift. Its brain matter was exposed, pulsing with a terrifying, rhythmic light that matched the flickering of the warp storm outside. Around its head, a halo of dark, jagged energy crackled, not the wild, untamed lightning of a psyker, but a controlled, mathematical discharge of stabilized warp essence. The creature looked at me, and for a moment, the pressure in my skull became a physical force that drove me to my knees. It didn't see me as a man. It saw me as a stray data point, a minor inefficiency in the harvest. It reached out with a clawed limb that ended in a cluster of sensory feelers, and I felt a cold, oily sensation as it probed my memories. It was looking for the coordinates of terror. It was looking for the Golden Throne. The realization hit me with the force of a bolt around. The Tyranids hadn't just learned to adapt to the warp to survive. They had done it to hunt the Emperor. For 10,000 years, the Astronomicon had been a lighthouse in the dark, but to the warp, attuned Hive Mind. It was a bonfire in a world of shadows. They weren't just following the scent of biomass. They were tracking the psychic resonance of the master of mankind. By integrating the essence of the warp, they had removed the interference that usually masked the imperial core. They were tuning their biological senses to the specific frequency of the Emperor's soul. I tried to reach for my pistol, to end my life before the creature could extract the navigational ciphers buried in my subconscious, but my arm refused to move. The spores in my blood had already bypassed my motor cortex. I was a spectator in my own body, a prisoner of my own biology. Outside the observation blister, the void began to bleed. The great rift was pulsing with a renewed intensity, but the colors were wrong. The vibrant, chaotic pinks and purples were being drained, replaced by a cold, sterile white blue. The Tyranid bio ships were acting as giant filters, stretching their fleshy webs across the tear in reality and straining the very fabric of the immaterium. I saw a Daemon, Prince of Slaanesh, a towering entity of grace and terror, manifest in the space between the ships. Usually, such a being would shatter the minds of any who beheld it, but the Tyranids didn't even slow down. A swarm of specialized bio-vessels, shaped like jagged shards of obsidian, collided with the Daemon. They didn't bite or claw. They emitted a frequency of psychic negation so intense that the Daemon's physical form began to flake away like dry paint. It was being erased from existence, its energy absorbed into the bioluminescent sacs of the swarm. The Hive Mind was colonizing the warp. I felt a tear run down my cheek, but it was thick and black. The neuroterrant leaned closer, its many eyes blinking in a sequence that felt like a countdown. I could hear the thoughts of the crew through the psychic link the creature had established. They weren't screaming for help. They were praying to the hive. They had found a new kind of salvation in the total loss of self. They were no longer afraid of death or damnation, because they were now part of something eternal and hungry. The fear of the warp, the terror of the dark gods, the crushing weight of the imperial creed, all of it had been replaced by the simple, singular purpose of the great devourer. It was a peace more horrifying than any war. I felt the last of my individual will beginning to fray at the edges, like a piece of parchment held too close to a flame. The ship's Vox system suddenly erupted with a burst of static, followed by a voice that sounded like it was being squeezed through a throat filled with sand. It was the High Magos from the Ghostful research station, or what was left of him. He was broadcasting on a forbidden inquisitorial channel, his voice a frantic jumble of binary and sobbing. He spoke of the soul eaters, a new strain of Tyranid that didn't just consume flesh, but could trap and store the psychic echoes of their victims. He claimed to have seen a hive ship that was powered by a captured choir of psychers, their screams being distilled into a concentrated warp, syrup that allowed the vessel to phase through solid matter. The transmission ended with a wet, crunching sound and the unmistakable chittering of 1,000 claws. The Magos hadn't been warning us. He had been providing a final status report for an audience that no longer existed. I looked back at the Neurotyrant. It had finished with my mind. It turned its attention to the primary tactical console, its feelers tapping into the ancient brass cogitators with a delicacy that was almost mocking. The screen flickered to life, displaying a map of the segmentum solar. A single, glowing line began to trace a path from Ghostful directly toward the heart of the Imperium. It wasn't a curved path dictated by warp currents or stable lanes. It was a straight line. The Tyranids were now capable of carving their own tunnels through the warp, ignoring the tides that had dictated human history for millennia. They were building a bridge of flesh across the ocean of souls. The pressure in the room was now so great that the transparasteel began to spider web with cracks. The air hissed out into the void, but I didn't suffocate. The spores in my lungs had already adapted, providing a crude, anaerobic cycle that kept my heart beating against its will. I saw the Iron Penance's sister ships, the Sword of Truth and the Hollowed Flame, being dismantled in the distance. They weren't being blown apart. They were being unzipped. Massive tentacles were pulling the hulls open, revealing the decks like the segments of an orange. Thousands of organisms were swarming inside, carrying away anything of value, metal, fuel, crew, leaving behind only a skeleton of rusted iron. In a matter of hours, there would be no sign that a fleet had ever existed here. There would only be more Tyranids. The Neurotyrant let out a low, vibrating hum that caused the floorboards to liquefy. I sank up to my knees in the organic slurry. The creature began to float toward the center of the bridge, its brain hilo expanding until it filled the entire room. I realized that it was preparing to broadcast a signal. Not a signal of victory, but a signal of arrival. It was calling the rest of the Hive Mind, telling them that the barrier had been broken. The feast was no longer limited to the living. The dead and the damned were now on the menu. The galaxy was no longer a battlefield. It was a ripening fruit, and the Tyranids were the rot that had finally reached the core. I closed my eyes, trying to find a single memory of home, of the sun over the spires of Hive Primus, of the smell of rain on stone. But the memories were being eaten. In their place, I saw only the endless, cold void and the great devourer's mouth, opening wide to swallow the stars. I felt my heart skip a beat, then another as it began to sync with the ship's rhythmic pulse. The transformation was nearly complete. I wasn't an imperial officer anymore. I was a cell in a larger organism. I was a witness to the end of the human era and the beginning of the biological eternity. The last thing I felt was a strange, hollow sense of relief. The hunger was no longer something I feared. It was something I was. The Iron Penance let out a final, metallic groan that sounded like a whale's song. Its engines, now repurposed as giant glandular sacs, flared with a sickly blue light. The ship lurched forward, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that it had never possessed when it was made of steel and faith. We were diving into the warp, not as travelers, but as conquerors. I could feel the presence of millions of other ships, a vast, silent armada of bone and shadow, all moving in perfect unison. We were the tide that would not be turned. We were the hunger that would not be sated. We were the end of the story. As the ship slipped between the layers of reality, I saw a vision of the future. I saw the golden throne toppled, the Emperor's desiccated remains being fed into a massive bio-furnace. I saw the great rift closing, not because the warp had been defeated, but because it had been consumed. I saw a galaxy of silence, where the only sound was the clicking of 1,000,000,000,000 carapaces under the light of a dead sun. It was a perfect, ordered world. A world without pain, without war, without hope. A world of the swarm. And as the darkness took me, I realized that I was looking forward to it. The struggle was over. The feed had begun. The bridge was now completely dark, save for the glowing veins of the neurotorrent. The creature was silent now, its work done. It had opened the door, and now it was simply waiting for the rest of its kind to follow. I could feel the ship's consciousness expanding, reaching out to touch the minds of the other vessels in the fleet. We were a single, colossal entity, a god of meat and shadow. The warp storm outside was no longer a threat. It was our environment, our playground. We were the masters of the impossible. I leaned back into the organic mass that had once been my command chair, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely at home. I am the last officer of the Iron Pennants. I am the first of the new breed. I am the bridge between the flesh and the void. My name no longer matters. My rank is a ghost. I am simply a part of the whole. The grey dust has filled my lungs, and the violet light has filled my eyes. The scratching in my head has turned into a symphony. The hunger is beautiful. The hunger is all there is. I am writing this with a finger that is no longer made of bone, using blood that is no longer my own. If this message ever reaches the surface of a world that is still breathing, know this: do not fight. Do not hide. It only makes the flavor more intense. Just wait. The silence is coming for you too, and it is the most magnificent thing you will ever hear. I can see the light of the Astronomicon ahead. It looks so small, so fragile. It looks like a spark in the dark, waiting to be snuffed out. We are almost there. We are moving faster than any ship should be able to move. The warp is pulling us forward, eager to be rid of the presence that is drinking it dry. We are the cure for the galaxy's madness. We are the ultimate evolution. We are the Tyranids, and we have finally learned how to eat the soul. The feast is about to begin, and I have a front row seat. The end is not a scream, it is a sigh of satisfaction. It is the closing of a mouth. It is the silence of the void is a lie. Space screams if you have the right ears to hear it. As the Iron Pennants, if it could still be called that, plunged deeper into the throat of the great rift, the screaming became a physical pressure that threatened to liquefy my remaining human organs. I was no longer a navigator of the stars, but a passenger inside a colossal, traveling womb. The ship's corridors had narrowed as the resin thickened, forming ridges like the esophagus of some Leviathan of ancient Terran myth. I found myself wandering the lower decks, or rather, being pulsed through them by the rhythmic contractions of the floor. My identity was a flickering candle in a hurricane of alien thoughts. I remembered my name, Julian Vane, but it felt like a name belonging to a character in a book I had read once and then discarded. The real me was the vibration in the walls, the hunger in the vents, and the cold, mathematical certainty of the harvest. We encountered a drifting hulk of an ancient vessel, a derelict from the dark age of technology that had been trapped in the warp for millennia. Normally, such a find would be a treasure for the Mechanicus or a tomb for the unwary, but to the warp, a tuned swarm. It was merely an obstacle in the digestive tract. I watched through a sensory pit that had grown over the starboard observation port as a cluster of specialized Tyranid organisms, shaped like jagged, multi-layered harpoons, launched themselves at the ancient metal. They didn't just impact. They began to vibrate at a frequency that caused the molecular bonds of the ancient hull to fail. The steel turned to a fine, gray powder that was instantly vacuumed into the mouths of the bio ships. There was no salvaged technology, no preserved history. There was only the conversion of matter into more of the hive. The past was being erased to fuel the eternal present of the devourer. I reached the engine room. The room was an inadequate term for the cavernous, pulsing chamber of meat that now occupied the center of the ship. The twin plasma reactors had been encased in a translucent, heat-resistant membrane that looked like the egg sac of a giant spider. The radiation was being siphoned off by rows of glowing tube, like organisms that converted the lethal energy into a nutrient-rich ichor. The air here was hot and smelled of ozone and scorched sugar. I saw a group of former tech priests, their red robes now fused to their mutated flesh, tending to the organic reactors with a devotion that transcended their former binary faith. They were no longer praying to the machine god. They were listening to the heartbeat of the hive. Their mechadendrites had been replaced by twitching, segmented tentacles that could feel the slightest fluctuation in the ship's metabolic rate. They were the white blood cells of this new, living vessel. The pressure in the Empyrean began to shift. We were approaching a calm in the storm, a pocket of space where the warp current swirled into a stagnant pool. In the center of this pocket sat a fortress, monastery of the word bearers, a jagged needle of obsidian and silver that had stood for 10,000 years. It was protected by a wall of screaming souls, a psychic barrier that would have incinerated any normal fleet. But the splinter fleet Ouroboros did not attack with fire or shells. It simply surrounded the fortress and began to hum. It was a low, resonant sound that bypassed the physical and struck directly at the soul. I felt it in my teeth, in my marrow, in the very core of my being. It was the sound of a billion minds thinking a single, unified thought empty. The psychic barrier didn't shatter, it simply evaporated. The souls that formed the wall were not released into the warp, they were inhaled. The bio ships acted like colossal bellows, drawing the spiritual essence of the monastery's defenses into their own internal reservoirs. I saw the word bearers on the battlements, their ornate armor glowing with the power of the dark gods. But as the Tyranid hum intensified, their colors faded. The runes on their shields went dark. The Daemons they had bound to their service began to shrivel, their forms losing cohesion as the warp energy that sustained them was sucked away. It was a spiritual famine. The masters of the warp were being starved by a predator that didn't even recognize their gods. The invasion of the monastery was a masterclass in biological efficiency. The Tyranids didn't land in pods. They flowed onto the station in a liquid stream of microorganisms. The obsidian walls began to soften and weep, the very stone being digested by acid-secreting spores. I watched through the ship's collective vision as a hive tyrant, its armor etched with shifting, non-Euclidean patterns, walked through the main gates. A chaos lord, a giant of a man warped by the favors of the pantheon, stepped forward to challenge it. He swung a mace that could shatter worlds, but the tyrant didn't dodge. It caught the blow with a claw that pulsed with a stabilizing warp field, neutralizing the mace's destructive energy. With its other limb, the tyrant struck, its blade not cutting the heretic's flesh, but unraveling his timeline. The Lord didn't die. He simply ceased to have ever been. His armor clattered to the floor, empty and rusted, as if it had been sitting there for centuries. This was the horror of the adaptation. The Tyranids were no longer just killing, they were rewriting the rules of causality. By mastering the warp, they had gained the ability to manipulate the warp, time that governed the immaterium. They could accelerate the rot of an empire or slow the death of a star. I felt a surge of cold terror as I realized that the Imperium's greatest strength, its sheer scale, and the vast gulfs of time it had endured, was now its greatest weakness. The hive mind could simply wait out our defenses in a pocket of slowed time, or it could accelerate our decay until our fortresses crumbled to dust in a matter of seconds. We were fighting a war in 4 dimensions against an enemy that viewed time as just another resource to be consumed. I felt the neurotyrant's presence return to my mind, more forceful than before. It wanted me to see something. It pushed my consciousness out of the iron penance and into the void, connecting me to the vast, shimmering web of the entire fleet. I saw thousands of ships, each one a unique biological experiment, all vibrating in perfect harmony. We were moving toward a destination that made my soul recoil. It was a rift, but not a natural one. It was a wound in the galaxy created by the Tyranids themselves. A rift. They were using the energy they had siphoned from the Gorseful system to tear a hole directly into the heart of the segmentum solar. They weren't just traveling, they were folding the galaxy like a piece of parchment. As we entered the rift, the sensation was like being turned inside out. The stars became streaks of raw, pulsing meat, and the void became a thick, amniotic fluid. I could see the thoughts of the hive mind as a physical structure, a towering cathedral of logic and hunger that reached from the beginning of time to its inevitable end. There were no gods here, no emperor, no chaos. There was only the swarm. I saw the fates of 1,000,000 worlds being weighed and measured, their biomass calculated down to the last milligram. It was a cold, beautiful census of extinction. I found myself back in the navigation spire, gasping for breath as the spores in my lungs worked overtime to stabilize my heart. The officer grafted to the chair was gone, replaced by a crystalline growth that looked like a jagged, blue brain. It was tapping into the ship's long-range sensors, projecting a map of the target system. I recognized the icons. It was the Macragge system, the jewel of Ultramar. The Tyranids were returning to the site of their greatest defeat, but this time, they weren't coming as a simple hive fleet. They were coming as the masters of the warp. The reports from the fleet's vanguard began to filter through the psychic link. The Ultramarines, those paragons of order and discipline, were already engaging the first wave. But their tactics were failing. They were firing at shadows that weren't there and defending against ghosts. The Tyranids were using warp, leap, organisms, creatures that could teleport short distances by momentarily slipping into the Empyrean. A squad of intercessors would find themselves surrounded by gynostealers that had materialized directly inside their defensive perimeter. The bolt of fire, once so effective, was being absorbed by the shimmering warp shields of the larger beasts. The pride of the Imperium was being humbled by a force that had learned to play by a different set of rules. I felt a strange sense of pity for my former kin. They were still fighting the old war, the war of iron and fire. They didn't understand that the enemy had moved beyond the material. I watched a strike cruiser, the Blade of Hera, attempt to ram a Tyranid bio ship. Instead of a collision, the bio ship simply phased out of existence, allowing the cruiser to pass harmlessly through the space it had occupied. When the cruiser had passed, the bio ship reappeared and extended its tentacles, wrapping them around the cruiser's engines and draining the plasma core in a matter of heartbeats. The ship was left a cold, drifting tomb, its crew still at their stations, wondering why their world had gone dark. The Neurotyrant stood over the navigation console, its many limbs moving in a blur of motion. It was orchestrating a symphony of destruction, directing the movements of millions of organisms with a precision that would make a Primarch weep. It wasn't just a general, it was a god mind, a localized manifestation of the hive mind's total will. It turned to look at me, and I saw my own reflection in its compound eyes. I looked ancient, my skin like cracked parchment, my eyes glowing with that same sickly violet light. I was no longer a man. I was a relic of a dead civilization, kept alive only as a witness to its end. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest as the thorn, like protrusion I had seen earlier, finally broke through the skin. It wasn't a thorn, it was a sensory organ, a small, twitching eye that looked around the room with a mind of its own. I screamed, but the sound was a discordant screech that echoed the Neurotyrant's own voice. My body was no longer my own. It was a canvas on which the Hive Mind was painting its next masterpiece. I felt my legs fuse together, forming a single, muscular trunk that anchored me to the floor. I was becoming part of the ship's infrastructure, a living pillar in the cathedral of the swarm. As my consciousness began to merge with the ship's primary neural network, I saw the final plan. The Tyranids weren't just attacking Ultramar to eat its people. They were going to use the psychic resonance of the Ultramarines' collective courage and faith as a focal point to expand the rift. They were going to turn the entire segmentum into a permanent extension of the Hive Mind's consciousness. The warp and the materium would be fused into a single, organic nightmare, a realm where death was impossible and hunger was the only law. It was the ultimate victory of biology over entropy. The iron pennants let out a low, vibrating hum as it prepared to exit the rift. We were seconds away from the heart of the Macragge system. I could feel the presence of the other ships around us, a vast, silent forest of teeth and wings. We were the storm, and we were about to break over the heads of the faithful. I tried to find a single spark of defiance, a single reason to keep fighting, but there was nothing left. The logic of the hive was too perfect, too complete. Why struggle against the inevitable? Why fight the tide when you can become the water? The grey dust in the air had turned into a thick, shimmering mist that tasted of copper and old books. It was the smell of a library being burned, the scent of 1 billion lives being reduced to their base chemical components. I leaned my head back against the organic wall, feeling the cool, wet touch of the matter against my skin. The scratching in my head had become a beautiful, complex melody, a song of consumption and rebirth. I closed my eyes and let the music take me. The last thing I saw before my human eyes finally clouded over was the map of the galaxy. The red icons of the Imperium were being swallowed by a spreading stain of violet and black. It looked like an ink blot on a white sheet, a growing shadow that left nothing behind. And then the map itself began to dissolve, the lines of the sectors and the names of the stars fading away until there was only a blank, pulsing void. The story was over. The record was closed. There was only the hunger, and the hunger was good. We are exiting the rift now. The light of Macragge's sun is hitting the observation blister, but it looks cold and distant. I can see the orbital defenses, the proud rings of steel and fire, but they look like toys in the face of the coming storm. The Neurotyrant is rising, its halo glowing with a blinding, terrifying light. It is time. The harvest has reached its peak, and the great devourer is ready to take its seat at the head of the table. I am the witness. I am the bridge. I am the end. The emergence into the Macragge system was not the violent transition of a conventional warp jump. It was a slow, agonizing hemorrhage of reality. The iron pennants did not so much arrive as it did manifest, its organic whole unfolding from the throat of the rift like a necrotic flower blooming in the vacuum. I was no longer merely Julian vein, but a sensory node within the ship's primary cortex. My consciousness stretched across the miles of pulsing tissue and calcified bone that formed our collective body. Through the ship's multifaceted ocular banks, I saw the jewel of Ultramar. Macragge was a beacon of order in a dying universe, its orbital plates bristling with the gold and blue of the 13th Legion, its atmosphere clear and defiant. But to my new, evolved senses, the planet looked like a ripening fruit, heavy with the psychic nectar of 10,000 years of civilization. The hunger I felt was no longer a metaphor, it was a physical gravity, a pull that directed every ship in the splinter fleet Ouroboros toward the world's fragile crust. The orbital defenses opened fire with a fury that should have scarred the stars. Lance batteries and macro cannons unleashed a torrent of energy that turned the void white, but the results were not what the defenders expected. The Tyranid fleet did not shatter, it rippled. The warp-attuned carapaces of the ships absorbed the kinetic and thermal energy, shunting the excess force into the local empyrean. I felt the vibration of the impacts as a dull, pleasant thrumming in my nerves. The shields of the iron pennants, now a shimmering film of stabilized warp matter, deflected the most powerful lance strikes with a mathematical contempt. We were a predator that had learned to eat the very weapons used against us. Every shot fired by the Macragge defense grid was merely more energy for us to consume, more raw power to fuel the birth of the next generation of swarms. The counter-offensive from the Ultramarines was led by the Macragge's Honor, a ship of legend that had stood since the dawn of the Imperium. As the massive Gloriana-class vessel surged forward to meet us, I felt a tremor of ancient memory, a flicker of the awe and fear I once held for such icons. But the Neurotarant, standing at the center of our bridge, merely tilted its oversized skull. It projected a psychic pulse so concentrated that it created a physical shockwave in the void. The pulse hit the Macragge's Honor not as a blast of fire, but as a command. The ship's Geller field, designed to keep the warp at bay, was suddenly forced into a state of inverted resonance. The protective bubble didn't collapse, it began to grow inward, dragging the ship's own internal reality into a pocket of compressed, non-Euclidean space. I watched as the proud vessel began to twist like a piece of wire, its decks folding over one another as the crew inside were compressed into a singular, screaming point of matter. It was a victory of geometry over steel. The descent to the surface was a rain of black and violet light. We did not use mycetic spores this time. We used warp anchors. Massive, crystalline shards of bone were fired from the ships, tearing through the atmosphere and embedding themselves into the mountains around the fortress of Hera. As they struck, they didn't explode. They began to pulse, creating localized zones of silence where the laws of physics ceased to apply. Within these zones, the Ultramarines found their power armor failing, their bolters jamming, and their hearts slowing to a crawl. The Tyranids that emerged from the shadows were not the mindless beasts of the past, but the null strains, stalking, multi-limbed horrors that emitted a field of pure psychic negation. They moved through the ranks of the first company like smoke, their claws passing through ceramite as if it were parchment. I felt the ground of Macragge beneath the feet of a billion organisms. I was the gargoyle circling the high spires. I was the Carnifex smashing through the marble gates. I was the Ripper feasting on the rich, blue-blooded remains of the defenders. The taste of Macragge was sweet, the flavor of iron, rich soil, distilled faith, and the cold, sharp tang of desperate hope. The Hive Mind was not just eating the biomass, it was harvesting the legacy of the Primarch. Every drop of blood spilled on the marble floors was a data point, a genetic cipher being uploaded into the collective memory of the swarm. We were drinking the history of Ultramar, absorbing its tactical brilliance and its stoic endurance into our own evolving blueprint. The fortress of Hera was the last bastion. I watched through the eyes of a lictor as it scaled the high walls, its body phasing in and out of the material plane to bypass the automated sentry guns. Inside the Great Hall, the Ultramarines were making their final stand around the empty throne of their father. They fought with a bravery that was almost beautiful, a rhythmic dance of chainswords and fire. But the outcome was never in doubt. For every warrior they felled, 100 more took its place, and these new arrivals were already adapted to the specific combat style of their predecessors. The Tyranids were learning in real time, their nervous systems evolving to anticipate every parry, every thrust, every desperate maneuver. It wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. The Neurotarant arrived in the throne room, floating on a carpet of thick, iridescent mist. It did not fight, it simply existed. And its presence was enough to turn the air into a toxic slurry that dissolved the lungs of the remaining defenders. I felt the creature's focus sharpen as it approached the inner sanctum. It was looking for the genetic records of the Ultramarines. The sacred gene seed that was the foundation of their brotherhood. To the Hive Mind, this was the ultimate prize, the concentrated essence of a demigod, a roadmap to the peak of human biological potential. As the creature's tentacles probed the ancient stasis vaults, I felt a surge of triumph that shook the entire fleet. The final piece of the puzzle was in our grasp. The integration was immediate. The Hive Mind didn't just store the gene, seed, it began to replicate it, weaving the strands of the Primarch's DNA into the carapaces of the next generation of Tyranid warriors. I saw the results on the battlefields outside. New organisms were emerging from the spawning pools. Creatures with the tactical flexibility of an Astartes, the resilience of a Primarch, and the bottomless hunger of the void. They were the Primaris swarm, a perfect fusion of Imperial engineering and Xenos evolution. With this new adaptation, there was no longer any force in the galaxy that could stand against us. The Imperium's own greatest weapons had been turned against it, refined and perfected by the cold logic of the great Devourer. As the sun began to set over the ruins of Macragge, the planet began to change color. It was no longer the vibrant blue and green of a living world, but a dull, pulsing violet. The rift we had brought with us began to expand. Anchored by the crystalline shards we had driven into the earth, Macragge was becoming a permanent gateway. A throat in the center of the Imperium that would never close. I could see the light of the Astronomicon flickering in the distance, a dying candle in a rising tide of shadow. The Emperor's light was being pulled into the rift, filtered through the Tyranid fleet, and redistributed as a cold, sterile energy that fed the growth of the swarm. The galaxy was being turned inside out, the light of the stars being used to illuminate the internal stomach of an alien god. I felt the final remnants of my humanity slip away as the iron penance began to dissolve its own internal structures. The ship was no longer needed as a vessel. It was being repurposed as a birthing sac for the next phase of the invasion. I felt the metal of the bridge melting around me, turning into a warm, organic soup that cradled my distorted body. I was no longer a witness. I was the seed. I felt my consciousness being fragmented, split into a million tiny pieces and distributed among the new, born organisms that were crawling out of the ship's decaying hull. I was the hunger. I was the void. I was the end of all things, and I was satisfied. The last image I saw, before the collective mind of the swarm completely overwhelmed my individual awareness, was the silhouette of a new hive ship rising from the ruins of the fortress of Hera. It was massive, its hull shaped in the likeness of a winged warrior, its surface glowing with the stolen light of the Astronomicon. It was the ultimate predator, a god of meat and shadow that would carry the hunger to the very gates of terror. The war was over. The error of man was a forgotten footnote in the archives of the Hive Mind. There was only the silence of the feeding and the eternal, cold dark of the stars. The galaxy was finally quiet. The meal was complete. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a total, unified purpose. On Macragge, the trillions of organisms that now carpeted the world moved as one, a single, colossal entity breathing in time with the heartbeat of the Hive Mind. The oceans had been drained into massive, translucent sacs. The atmosphere had been filtered into a nutrient-rich mist. The very mountains had been ground down to provide minerals for the fleet. There was nothing left of the world that was. It was a blank canvas, a tabula rasa upon which the Devourer would write its next chapter. I felt the collective gaze of the swarm turn toward the heart of the galaxy, toward the flickering ember of terror. The path was clear. The bridge was built. The hunger was absolute. I am no longer writing. I am no longer thinking. I am simply the vibration in the air, the pulse in the ground, the shadow in the warp. The story of Julian Vane ends here, but the story of the swarm has only just begun. The universe is a vast, empty larder, and we have only just finished the first course. The stars are waiting, and they look delicious. The light of the Emperor is a flickering flame, and we are the wind that will blow it out. There is no hope. There is no pain. There is only the feed, and the feed is eternal.